The conference has been muted.
So welcome everyone. We're just getting set up and we'll start in just a couple minutes. Welcome everyone. We're going to give ourselves just one more minute before we get started. Hang tight. Thank you. Okay, well I see a lot of folks have joined our webinar today, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Just a couple of things to note before I turn it over to Aria Summers to give more information is that we have put everyone on forced mute to help mitigate background noise as we have a lot of folks joining us today. So we will not be opening the line for our question and answer portions of today's presentation. Instead, in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you should see a chat box where you are welcome to add questions at any point during the presentation as you think of them and want to share your questions with the speakers. And we will be responding to those questions through the chat box, and during our Q&A portion, we'll address those questions. So please feel free to use the chat box as much as you want to. And without much more, I'm going to turn it over to Aria Summers, who will be moderating today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Harmony. And welcome everyone, and we are very excited in honor of World Refugee Day to present today's webinar, Expanding Perspectives on Refugee Integration. We would like to extend a special thanks to our webinar co-sponsors listed here: International Human Rights Funder Group, Philanthropy New York, Southern California Grantmakers, Forum of Regional Associations of Grantmakers, Colorado Association of Funders, and San Diego Grantmakers. We'd also like to extend a special thanks to our GSER staff, Harmony Hayes, Michael Cavat, and Camila Rodriguez Sackburn for their assistance in preparing for today, and of course to our speakers for their time and effort in preparing for today's webinar. Before we begin today, I would like to start out by saying that GSER would like to express our deepest sympathies for the victims of the Orlando mass shooting and their families, friends, and communities. We stand in unity with the LGBTQ, Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities in defiance of hatred and fear. And countering today's hostile environment, we will redouble our efforts to build bridges, forge unity, and highlight the intersections of the wide-ranging social justice issues. And today, we are confronting one of these. The UNHCR announced today that there are a record number of refugees globally. Our goals for today are to learn about community-based projects working at the intersections of race, age, and gender, to expand our perspectives on how refugee integration happens in our communities, understanding that integration is a dynamic, two-way process in which both newcomers and the receiving communities evolve to work together to build vibrant and cohesive communities. There's a broad spectrum of what integration means, ranging from civic to financial to educational to workforce. Today, we hope to expand our perspectives on how refugee integration is happening in our communities. And finally, we will explore what funders are doing to be inclusive of inclusive of refugees in their grant-making strategies. This is our agenda today. We're very excited that we have two organizations, Young Women Empowered from Seattle and Freedom Inc. from Madison, Wisconsin, that will be presenting today. In addition, we will be hearing from Novo Foundation and Unbound Philanthropy about their funder strategies. And so without further ado, I'm honored to present Young Women Empowered. Jamie Rose Edwards is the co-director and co-founder of Young Women Empowered based in Seattle, Washington. She has a 10-year history of founding, funding, and nurturing organizational growth, and she oversees Why We, a mentorship organization that provides leadership programs for over 500 girls and women annually. She is also in private consulting practice to support organizations and individuals who are piloting innovative projects to map their strategic goals and implement new programs. Welcome, Jamie Rose.
Thank you. Thank you for the honor of being included in this webinar on such an important topic. So as it was said, I am the co-founder and co-director of Young Women Empowered. And our mission is to empower young women from diverse backgrounds to step up as leaders in their schools, communities, and the world. We do this through intergenerational mentorship, intercultural collaboration, and creative programs that equip participants with the confidence, resiliency, and leadership skills needed to achieve their goals and improve their communities. Can I advance the slides, or do you guys advance them? There we go.
We'll advance them.
Okay, sorry. We serve over 500 girls and women each year through our program. Our girls come from very diverse classes, races, cultures, family backgrounds, sexual orientations, and immigrant and refugee populations. We serve girls from all walks of life. So currently 80% of our young women are girls of color, 90% are low income, and 65% are from immigrant and refugee backgrounds. And our foundational belief is that bringing together diverse groups and working towards social change together fosters global citizenship, allyship, and compassion. So the keys to access for making our programs accessible to girls from all walks of life, we've discovered these over the years. And one thing that's interesting about our programs is that we did not set out to serve a particular population of girls when we first started in 2010, but because we provided these keys to access, we've attracted the diverse population that we currently serve, and the diversity of our population keeps growing because of these points of access. So for us in the greater Seattle region, where there's really not great public transportation, providing transportation has been a real key. So we purchase special insurance so that our mentors can drive to girls' homes and schools and pick them up and bring them to our programs, which has broken down a huge barrier for girls who otherwise wouldn't be able or allowed to come. We provide healthy, nutritious meals at all of our programs so that girls who couldn't afford to bring food to a retreat or to a day-long program will always have food. And we provide full scholarships to any girl in need. Our tuition policy is pay what you can, and we trust girls and families to opt in at the level that they're able to pay for our programs. For most of our girls, that is nothing. For some of our families, they're from higher income brackets and they're able to pay full tuition and make a donation towards someone else's tuition. But by not providing a lengthy scholarship application process, girls are able to come who otherwise would be too intimidated or have a language barrier or a paperwork barrier to filling out the scholarship application. Representative leadership is key to access, so making sure that our staff, our board, and our mentors are from similar backgrounds to the girls we're serving. This helps in all kinds of ways for building trust, for girls being leaders and role models who look like them and can relate to their experiences, for gaining parental trust. It's a key value of our organization, and it's one of the primary reasons why girls from such diverse backgrounds have access. We provide a very easy and culturally aware enrollment process, so we're aware that not everyone has access to internet to fill out our online applications, so we make special trips to young people's homes, to young people's schools to help with the enrollment process. We do everything we can to make sure the paperwork isn't a barrier to participation. One thing that's very interesting is when we launched our program in 2010, we didn't realize that we were going to end up with such a large immigrant and refugee community, and a big part of that had to do with us being a single gender program, and a lot of families allowed their daughters to participate in YWE, and the girls told us that if it had been a co-ed program, they wouldn't have been allowed to participate. So the single gender approach has allowed girls to participate who normally can't go to after-school programs and weekend programs. And also because all of our programs, girls 13 to 18 can enroll, so a lot of girls start at age 13 and stay with us through their whole middle school and high school career. And so over time, the parents and girls trust us a lot more each year. So oftentimes girls who aren't allowed, for example, to go to our overnight retreats and sleep over the first year or two, by year 3 or 4, they're allowed to do that. And the single gender approach, as well as the long-term relationship with girls and families, has allowed that trust and access to be built over time. In terms of our outreach, connecting with ambassadors who are trusted by the communities that we want to serve or that we currently serve, so connecting with college counselors, with religious leaders, with community leaders who are trusted by girls and their families, and then having those folks refer girls to our programs has been the primary and most effective method of outreach. And now, since we've been around for 6 years now, most of our outreach happens girl to girl and parent to parent. As the word spreads about our programs, we currently have more girls who want to enroll than we can accommodate because so many families are finding out about us and wanting their daughters to be included. And then most importantly, we listen to the young women we serve, so we make sure that our curriculum is relevant and personalized, and that there's always a social justice and oppression lens over everything that we do. So our girls let us know. We provide a survey at the end of every program day, and take feedback from the girls about what they're learning, what they're not learning, what they want more of, what they don't like, what they do like, and then we are fearless in our commitment to revising our curriculum and the subjects that we're covering in order to best serve the young women who are involved in our program. So that leads to a highly personalized curriculum. Our current programs, we have a school year program that runs one Saturday a month for the whole school year, and then we run special events and retreats and workshops in between. But once a month, we meet as a big group of about 90 women and girls. In addition to that, as part of that program, we offer 2 major public events that the girls can bring their families and friends to, and that's our Career Day, where we bring over 25 professional women speakers from different career paths that the girls have expressed interest in, to talk about those careers and how a young woman might develop her skills to get on the pathway to that career. We also have a Health Day, where we focus on emotional, mental, physical, and sexual health, where we bring in different speakers and workshop leaders to answer girls' questions and give them access to health care. We offer a theater camp called Why We Speak, a writing camp called Why We Write. We offer a year-round Nature Connections program that's focused on giving girls access to the outdoors who normally wouldn't get to visit state parks or farms, and sites like Mount Rainier. We also are beginning to offer a lot more academic and professional support after school. And this fall, our office is going to be moving to a location where the girls will more easily be able to come after school daily to work with their mentors on homework, SAT prep, college essays, or just have a safe space to come to and be with each other and be with our mentors after school. And then we also are getting increasing interest from our alumni and from middle school girls. So in 2017, we are going to be launching new programs for alumni and middle schoolers. Our current outcomes, so about 99% of our youth and mentors say that our programs are safe and supportive, all-girl environments that are free from bullying and violence. 98% of parents report that Why We improves their daughter's self-confidence. 97% of youth report that Why We taught them to appreciate diversity and interact confidently with people from different backgrounds. And 92% of our alumni credit Why We've influenced in helping them achieve college and career success. Some examples of our impact specifically on immigrant and refugee populations are our Why We Write camp, which happens during the summer. It brings together professional writers of color with our young women to work with them on telling their stories. And a lot of our girls who struggle with English have expressed that this camp was the first time where they experienced a love of writing. Getting to express themselves creatively through writing has really helped them both in their confidence building and in their academic development, because they're working with mentors who really support them in telling their stories and expressing themselves creatively, which has led to extreme academic improvement as well as confidence building. In our Why We Speak program, that's a very transformative theater camp where the girls tell their real life stories, and it's an opportunity for us to bring the girls' stories to the Seattle Repertory Theater, which is one of the most famous theaters in Seattle, right in the heart of downtown, and to feature young women of color stories on that stage for a mostly upper middle class white audience has been both empowering and transformative for the girls and for audience members to hear those stories and understand the importance and the power of the young women in their communities from all different backgrounds. And in general, our programs really center an awareness of the intersectionality of oppression, so of racism, classism, religious discrimination, language discrimination, et cetera. And as we personalize our curriculum, we really strive to fill those gaps for the young women, so looking at each young woman and her unique needs and doing everything we can to tailor our services to meet her unique needs. And now you're going to have a chance to hear from one of our alumni who's currently has just joined our board. She was started in our program 6 years ago in 2010 when we first started. So here's Rawa.
Hello, guys. My name is Rahul Gavin Michael. I was born and raised in Sudan, and I am very honored to be part of this because I was raised in a refugee camp myself, and this is very, it's nice to be able to hear people that talk about this. And so I want to talk about how YWE has impacted me in my life and till right now. First thing I really appreciate about YWE is my mentorship that I get from them. With everything I do, I have someone guiding me the right way, like building relationship and getting my job applications done whenever I need them. And like our mentors become our friends. They become our longtime friends where we could connect to them through whatever we're going through, whether it's school or job or personal problems going on, that they could help you with whatever they can. And job application, I've gotten almost every job I've applied for because of my great reference mentors that I put on my job. And and another thing is that I like is the academic support I received from YWE. Because when I first finished high school, I applied to Wazoo, and when I got to Wazoo, Washington State University, I wasn't able to continue because of financial problem. And
Are you okay, Rawa?
yeah, I'm okay. Hold on a second.
I apologize, everyone. It's an emotional topic for Rawa.
Anyways, when I got back from the school, because I wasn't able to continue, I came back by week, and I was lost. I told them what happened, everything and stuff, and I was able to still be part of YWE because I was close to home again, and I continued my school. But at some point, I wasn't able to do YWE in school at the same time because of time stuff, and I needed to get a job and pay for some of my school, and YWE was there to give me a hand and help me continue my education. They're like, what can we do to support you? And then that's when Jamie was like, we could hire you as an intern. Like, you already do a lot of work with YWE, so we can hire you to be an intern, and you can still be involved with YWE and further your education with whatever that's your goal is. So I'm forever grateful for that. And then school application, I recently just submitted my application to University of Washington for my health studies program, and my main focus is going to be global health. And they helped me fill out the application and rereading my personal statement and making sure everything is on point, everything's perfect. And just a couple days ago, I heard back from University of Washington accepting my letter saying that they would like to have me for part of the school and part of the program, which I'm very grateful for. And another thing was attending conferences, career day, all the skills I've gained from YWE, I'm able to use in my future life and with what I want to study in school. And one thing YWE always made sure was girls got transportation from point A to point B. Girls were able to get picked up from whether it's their school or their community center to YWE's event, and they were able to return safely. And a lot of girls with like my kind of background from different foreign country, this is a foreign country to us living in the U.S., so our parents always had a hard time sending us off, and they weren't sure if we're going to come back 100% or not. But throughout those years, they've gained like trust, and because we were always returning in one piece, we were always safe. We came back laughing, like hugging. It was just full of love when we came back home. So the safety, because of the safety they gave us, and my parents have just, they trust them now, like throughout all this experience. That is it for me.
Thank you, Bawa.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your story.
No problem. Thank you.
So some of the takeaways that we would love funders to know is that investing in intersectional programs like Why We that are accessible to girls from all walks of life is a really great way to build global citizenship and build relationships across difference. So a lot of programs, Why We is one of the only programs for girls, at least in the Seattle area, where girls from really different backgrounds come together. Most programs, at least in our area, are for girls from a specific neighborhood, a specific background, a specific school, a specific religion. It's very rare to find programs that bring people together from all walks of life. And certainly in our experience, that's a huge and important investment. I would recommend asking organizations questions about how they're breaking down barriers to access and looking to invest in organizations that have representative leadership on their board and staff. So are they representative? Are the people leading their organization representative of the community that they are wanting to serve? And ask organizations what they need from you as an investor in order to make their programs more accessible. Things like buses, things like staff training and inequity issues, having multilingual staff, training for their mentors. These things are so important, and directing your investment toward increasing access can be a great way to help programs become more intersectional in who they're serving, even if it's not a program that's specifically for immigrant and refugee populations. And certainly in our experience, if you find an organization that is worth investing in, that you think is a good investment, general operating support is the best investment because the organization is really able to direct it to where it's going to make the most impact for them. Restricted gifts can be wonderful, but they can also create work to administer, and trusting the organization is a great way to maximize your impact. And thank you for including us and for investing in diverse young women who reinvest in our world.
Thank you so very much for what a powerful and moving story. Thank you, Rahwa, for sharing that. It's so courageous, and we really appreciate sharing your story and hearing about your program in Seattle. And now we'd like to move over to Madison, Wisconsin with Freedom Inc. Kabzwag Vaj was born in Laos, and she came to the United States as a refugee child with her mother and siblings. She's founder and co-executive director of Freedom Inc. and dedicated to ending gender-based violence and building collective power and social change within Southeast Asian and Black communities. Her advocacy started when she was 16 years old, assisting in housing at-risk teens and challenging abusive gender norms within her community. She is a strong believer that those who are most deeply impacted must be at the forefront of the movement. In recognition of her work, she was awarded the White House Champion of Change Award. Welcome, Kabzwag. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. I came to this country when I was about 5 years old. I actually lived in a refugee camp with my family. Our story is very similar to many refugees throughout the world, and that my father actually, because he was a military officer, was airlifted out of Laos, but my mother and the rest of us had to make the journey into safety into Thailand by foot. And I tell that story because it's National Refugee Day, and it's important that to share how we've all survived. The next slide. Freedom Inc. Started about, almost more than 15 years ago, when we first arrived as refugees in the United States. What we knew to be true was in the Hmong community, because we come from a very patriarchal system, a lot of the service providers that were set up to help resettle our families were led by a lot of men and elders. And so in 2000, the year 2000, I'd noticed that all the services that were out here to help my family didn't necessarily really impact me or my mother or my sisters and young folks. And so seeing that, I created Freedom Inc., which was to fit that niche, to really look at how women and girls and young folks were being left out in the service area. And so Freedom Inc. started in 2003. Today we are a Black and Southeast Asian organization in Madison, Wisconsin, and our mission is to end violence against queer, LGBTQ folks, women, girls, and young folks. Our story is pretty simple. Growing up, we didn't have a lot of resources, didn't have a lot of things that were that as Hmong women and girls, we could no resources in the community and also no support in the families. And so I often tell the story of how, sometimes you feel injustice and you don't really have terminology for it. And as a young person, I remember growing up in the Hmong families, and one of the things that I talk a lot about is gender inequity and also feeling injustice. In the Hmong families, typically when we have family gatherings and we have meals together, the women would cook and prepare the meals, and then the men and the boys would eat first. And so I just remember being at a very young age, understanding how that felt and understanding that I wanted to create a world that I wanted to live in a world that my mother and my sisters also got to eat, and that we would not have to wait for leftovers. And so I think that, like, my understanding of gender justice, I was very aware of that when I was very young. And so in 2003, I decided that I would create an organization that would meet the specific needs of Hmong women, elders, girls. And so as we started organizing within our own communities, what we found to be true was that because we were led by young people, we were led by women, we were led by femme folks, that it was really hard to get respect from the rest of the community. But as we were organizing within these pockets of Madison is very similar to other cities, but in Madison, folks who were low-income folks would live in pockets throughout the city. And so as we started organizing with Hmong women and girls, we would go into these low-income housing and we would do girl-specific programming. And the Black girls in the neighborhood would say, like, what about us? And so we knew enough to know that we weren't the right ones to create a Black girls program, but that we could create a space for them to, like, do something similar to what we were doing. And so this is how Freedom Inc. nationally became a Black and Southeast Asian organization. As you can see, today we are Southeast Asian. We have queer justice programs. We also knew enough that it wasn't enough to just create programs for the Black girls and Black folks within our organization. As a Southeast Asian organization, we also needed to invest in the leadership of Black folks if we were to be truly a Black and Southeast Asian organization. Thus, we created a co-director, and even though we didn't have resources and funding for that, we made it work, and we shared our resources. What you see here is every summer we have a Freedom School where Southeast Asian and Black youth come together and learn about the health inequities and health injustice within the community. Similarly to that, as you can see, we are a women and girls program, but we had a lot of young boys in the neighborhood who were saying, what about us? And so we then created a Hmong boys group. But the one thing that we told them that in order for them to be a part of our organization, they would have to be okay to follow the lead of queer, femme, gender nonconforming women and girls. And they agreed. And so we are also, we provide services and advocacy for young boys also. What you see here is what we believe right before the core values. This is part of our core values. What we believe is that in order to show up for each other as Southeast Asian and Black folks, that it wasn't enough to just build allyship, that we actually had to build families, and that we had to mirror what families would look like for Southeast Asian and Black youth. And so a lot of the things that we do, we talk a lot about not just becoming an ally, but becoming family to each other, and what does that look like? Some of our core values that help keep us grounded at Freedom Inc. is we believe that the community is the campaign. When you invest in the community, and win or lose, regardless of what campaigns you're working on, if people advance and people, if their lives are changed and they've gained something out of investing in them versus investing in the campaign, that ultimately we've already won. The other thing is that we believe that those most impacted must lead. What this means is that the solution's already in our community. All we need to do is invest, pour in resources, train, provide leadership development opportunities for those in our community so that they can advocate for themselves and advocate for those who they love. The other piece about one of our core values is we build collective power and capacities of leadership in the community. What that means is that I think oftentimes people think when they think about leadership development, they often think about young people, and they think about how do you build the capacity of young people to lead. What we do is we believe in not the passing of the torch, but the lighting of the torches, and so we believe in building capacity and leadership across the lifespan, different generations, from elders to young folks. And then we also work to end, ultimately we really work to end violence within our own families, but we also understand that systematic institutions and systems also perpetuate violence in our communities, and so we also organize to address state violence and system violence. Go ahead. Our work is intersectional because we believe in showing up as our whole selves. We often have young people who come to our space and they say they come back time and time again because it's a space where they can show up completely as their full selves. And so how do you organize and how do you create programs? How do you work? How do you advocate for people that want to show up as their full selves? And so there are so many issues that interconnect, and I think that our work, next slide, our work and all the things that we do really addresses the whole self and address all the issues that we as folks encounter. And so as you can see here, we have a lot of different programs, but some of the programs that are, I think, the most important to us is really building across the lifespan and showing leadership and building and investing in all of our communities. We really focus a lot on housing, or housing as a human right for Black folks, and food as a human right for Southeast Asian folks. The way that we work is we take a campaign or we take an issue and we specialize it to the communities that we're working with. These are just some of the work that we've done in the past 15 years. One of the campaign is we wanted to do a media campaign that engaged our communities, especially the Southeast Asian community, around queer justice. And these are some of the things that we put out into the community just to let the Hmong community understand and engage them in the first step of having conversations around queer justice. What does that look like? Another one of our programs that we work on is our anti-violence programs. We provide domestic violence services, sexual assault services. We provide same-gender SANDV services, or sexual assault and domestic violence services. And the one thing that makes our program, I think, stand out, and hence the White House award, was because we really do believe that in order to serve victims and survivors, there has to be just there can't just be service. You can't just provide them with services. You also have to give them tools beyond surviving violence, because I think that once you're done providing the services, what else is next? And so we really believe in organizing and creating advocates that can advocate for themselves and advocate for the rest of their community. And so these two slides here, what you see is M. Adams, who is my co-director, talking about Black Lives Matter. We're organizing around those issues. And then what you see on the other side are elders organizing to ask for land, public land for food to feed their families. And so how do we take folks who came into our agency to seek services, and how do we transform them so that they can be advocates for their own issues, at the same time advocate for the whole community? Every summer we also have youth summits, freedom schools. We have weekly support groups. On an average, we see about 100 young people every week, and we engage them in political education, as well as provide direct services for them. And the majority of the kids that we work with come from very poor families. A lot of the elders that we work with, even though they've been in this country for the past almost 40 years, Southeast Asian elders, especially Hmong and Cambodian elders, are still the most linguistically isolated population in the U.S. About 80% of them are linguistically isolated. What that means is that if there's a fire at their house and no one's home, there's no way for them to go to their neighbor and express what's happening. Or if they get locked out in the middle of winter, there's no way for them to get help. And so as refugees, even though we've been here for a long time, we continue to have language access issues. Some of the recommendations for funders or for people who are thinking about helping refugee communities throughout the U.S., I think that as a refugee child myself, and as someone who's worked in this community and been part of this community, I can tell you that the definitions can go from refugees to citizens, but the lived experiences always stay. And so I think that we've gotten some of our funders in the state of Wisconsin to recognize that you can't just fund refugee dollars, and refugee funding should not just be for folks who are fairly new within the refugee process in the U.S., but in fact there are many communities and families who continue to struggle, and being a refugee is pretty much your whole, it's going to be your whole life, and it's not just a definition, but it's people should look at the lived experiences. I think also it's really important that you fund organizations that are led by people who have this lived experience, people who are refugees or former refugees, people who are women, girls, LGBTQ, queer. I can tell you all that when I first started this organization, we rarely got funded because people did not, they were so used to the traditional leadership of men and elders that as young queer girls and women, we hardly, they thought that we were basically just a joke. Our organization was just around, as something that wasn't viable, and so that we hardly got any funding. I also think that it's important to fund and to look at funding through the lens, a gender lens. I tell this story a lot, but I say, my father was a refugee, my mother was a refugee, but my father's experience of protecting us is very different because my father was a military officer, but he didn't have to defend the village when he was gone. It was my mother who defended the children and the village. And then also it is a known fact that women also experience a lot of gender violence. And so crossing the border, my father was airlifted into Thailand, and those men who were not airlifted, many of them didn't face isolation. A lot of the sometimes what happened when we were crossing was women and girls would be separated and they would be sexually violated, or so there are like lived experiences that women and girls experience that men don't. And so I think that it's important that as we're looking to funding refugees, we're also looking at to funding refugees through a gender lens. And then I think it's also important that you all, or folks who are thinking about funding refugee programs, fund not only the service piece, but it's extremely important to fund social justice initiatives and organizing organizations, because beyond providing services to communities, there also has to be some sort of building of community, and I think that through the social justice lens and organizing, we can do that for refugee communities. Next slide. And so I just wanted to leave you all with, a thought that it's a lifetime to heal from being a refugee, and perhaps you'll never really heal, but that we get to build a new community in the U.S. and what does that community look like? And Freedom Inc. is a great example of how we came to this country and was placed in some of the poorest neighborhoods throughout the U.S. with no resources to figure out how we were going to make it. And we were stacked on top of each other and forced to learn from each other. And we started living in communities where predominantly was black and brown folks, and we were all extremely poor, but we did it somehow. And Southeast Asian refugees can indeed build new communities with folks who have already been here, and so Freedom Inc. is a great example of that. And so I just wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to share our story.
Thank you so very much, Kabzag. What an incredible story, and we have a couple of questions coming in, and we thank you for sharing your personal story, again, of great courage in honor of this day. And so I'd like to move to a couple of questions that have come up as the presentations have been moving forward. So for you, Kabzag, there's a question that came in about the communication styles and the dynamics between Black and Southeast Asian cultures. What has your experience been in that respect?
Yes, and so I think that is, we have so many lessons learned. I can tell you that we've learned from each other about direct communication. I'll give you the best example I can give you is, at the very beginning, we were having such a hard time because our communication styles were so different. Literally, we would go into a staff meeting, and our Black staff would be like, "This is the best meeting I've been to. I felt like people really heard me, and I was able to express myself." And then literally the Southeast Asian folks and Hmong folks would come out and be like, "That was the worst meeting I've ever been to. I didn't even get to say anything." And so we've learned a lot about direct communication. We've also learned a lot about, just because people communicate a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that they're upset, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't like you. And to really understand that as Asian folks or Hmong folks, sometimes we're not direct, and so you could ask if you want to borrow something from me, and my hesitation would be a no, but no, who would know that? And so I think that those are the kind of things that we really struggled through. We needed to figure out what was culture, the cultural differences, but then we also had to figure out what pieces of the Hmong folks or the Hmong staff, what pieces of how they were reacting to the Black staff was anti-Black. And so we've learned a lot about separating organizational development from cultural clashes to basically like some stuff are just anti-Black and we need to figure it out. And so a lot of in the past 8 years of like having to figure out and having to correct and having to apologize because there's so much anti-Blackness and so much things that we've been able to absorb that has contributed to the way that we look at Black folks. And so I mean, there's so many lived lessons learned that we can share about that, but I can tell you that one of that was us dismantling the anti-Blackness within our own beliefs and within our own community as Southeast Asian people.
Great, thank you so much. And Jamie Rose, there is a question for you as well. You'd highlighted some of the cost, transport, and language issues. And one of the funders would like to know, what are some culturally specific barriers that funders should be aware of with respect to the girls that you work with?
That's a very interesting question. I think that's where the girl centering and girl specific model that why we use is relevant, because we serve girls from so many different cultures. I can't just give one answer to that question, and even within the same culture there might be different family barriers to access. So I think for us it's about getting to know the individual girls and their families and what barriers they might be facing to participation, and doing everything we can to use a personalized and girl-centric approach to figure out how to break down those barriers. Certainly we've discovered as a single gender program that co-ed programs are often, young women are often not allowed to participate in. So being a single gender program has allowed participation from girls who often don't have access. And I do think this is where representative leadership is so important, and making sure that the people representing your organization and doing your outreach are representative of the young people that you want to work with, and also that you have a social justice lens with everything that you're doing, that you're aware of the intersectionality of oppression. So trying to paint with a broad stroke and say all populations are facing this barrier, we haven't found to be true. It's individual, and when you're bringing together such diverse groups, being really sensitive and doing a lot of listening is extremely important.
Great, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And now we're going to move on to exploring the funder perspective. And I'd like to welcome Ramatu Bangura from Novo Foundation. She's the Program Officer for Advancing Adolescent Girls' Rights. She has spent the last 20 years working with and on behalf of adolescent girls in the U.S. and with the Peace Corps in Costa Rica. She previously served as Program Director at the Sautu Yetu Center for African Women in the South Bronx, where she founded and managed a program designed to meet the educational, developmental, leadership, and college readiness needs of immigrant young women from West Africa. And Ramatu has also managed the girls program at GEMS and the DC Rape Crisis Center. So we're honored to have you. Welcome, Ramatu.
Thank you so much for having us, and I'm really, really excited to share the line with such amazing programs like Why We and Freedom Inc., who we love a lot, and also with Unbound Philanthropy. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
So I can go ahead and get started, and I'm going to focus my presentation on our Advancing Adolescent Girls' Rights Initiative. Novo has 4 other initiatives that I won't go into detail about, but many of them are overlapping and may come up again in this presentation, but I just wanted to make sure that it was clear that we're focusing in on the Adolescent Girls' Rights Initiative. So Novo was founded in 2006, so we're a relatively young foundation, by Peter and Jennifer Buffett. And the idea behind Novo was to foster a world based on partnership and collaboration and away from domination and exploitation, which feels very large. But the way that we kind of got to our work focused on women and girls was really kind of some advice from Warren Buffett, Peter's father, which was to look for undervalued assets, places where tremendous value is held, but not recognized. And so we often saw that the places where folks were doing so much work on behalf of their communities and to make the world better were often women and girls, but they were often not recognized and not given the spaces to really kind of take that leadership into a place that could be transformative on a larger scale. And so that's kind of where Novo kind of began. And so what we try to do throughout our work is try to embrace risk. We have the privilege of having a board that is really excited about taking risks, that really looks to partner with organizations that often are nascent or are maybe still trying to figure out what their work is, and really partner with them on how they might do that. We work very hard to provide general operating support as much as possible, again, with the idea that folks know what they need to do their work, and that the ability, for example, as Jamie Rose said, to be able to really be girl-centered means you may have to be flexible, that for one population, for what you need to do for one population, you may not need to do for another, and folks need the flexibility to be able to do that work. And we know with issues that are really complex, especially issues such with gender and race and class, that we don't often know what form that change will take, but we do trust in individuals and people that are committed and excited about the work to move that work along. And so we really try very hard to defer to the advocates and the activists that are doing the work and have them really lead and guide us in the strategies that we take moving forward. So as many of you may have heard already, NOVO has recently announced a $90 million commitment to girls and young women of color here in the United States over the next 7 years. And we are still very early in the process of really doing listening sessions in various parts of the country to learn from advocates and activists and young women and girls what they'd like to see that work look like. So we're still very early in that stages, but we can share with you 4 of the values that kind of are underpinning that work, and that will kind of provide a framework for what that strategy will be. We expect to announce that strategy in February, in early 2007, actually. So the first piece is girls setting the agenda. And we say that she knows a lot about the solution once she's able to see the problem. And so what we try to do there is to lead with the lived experiences of girls, co-designing with her, designing for her needs, giving her spaces to really see and understand the forces that exist in her life that might be creating barriers for her, kind of undoing the internalized oppression that says to her that it must be her fault, and then really working with her to design solutions around that. Another piece of this framework is around fueling the activists and really trying to support the work of the folks that have been supporting girls, whether they're girls or they're adult allies, and making sure that they have spaces to create new shared visions, new visions of community, what it means to engage in intergenerational leadership that really both centers young women and girls, but also recognizes the wisdom of the folks that have been working on their behalf and supporting them over the years. One of the pieces that's really important to us is really advocating for a bigger and stronger field. That means making sure that our peer foundations are also supporting the work of girls and young women of color in their communities, and that those resources are going to work that's happening in community on behalf of girls. And so we have been doing a lot of work. You all may have heard of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, which is really focused on pushing the donor community to really recognize the unique needs of young women and girls of color in the U.S. And then finally, a new narrative, really challenging the narrative that girls and young women of color are okay relative to boys and young women of color, and really trying to find the story and the narrative that's missing that allows so much of their needs and their aspirations to be ignored in a lot of spaces, but in the funding spaces in particular. So this is just a quick graphic of kind of how we see that change happening. So starting with girls, that there's a vision for change from the ground up, that their advocates and their champions are fueled and ready and able to work collectively, that we're really challenging the narratives that hinder that work, and that through direct support, system change, and movement leadership, we can see that girls are connected locally and nationally to one another and are able to drive movement towards their needs and their aspirations in life. So just look, that's kind of a broad overview of NOVO. In terms of our work in immigrant and refugee spaces, our work in the Global South focused on ending violence against women and girls has really had a very explicit, named focus on adolescent girls in humanitarian settings. So that's in conflict and post-conflict settings, that's in humanitarian settings, and that's across many of our initiatives. There's quite a bit of overlap in that space. Here in the U.S., we have more of a cross-cutting attention to this population, so rather than a specific focus on immigrant and refugee girls, we look for them in every piece of the work that we do. And I think also just personally, having worked with immigrant and refugee populations, it is one of the, I feel like it's almost a crusade, is trying to figure out spaces where where the immigrant and refugee girls can be heard, and that programming is really reflecting what they're needing. And so we see that in the U.S., our U.S. work is more cross-cutting in that respect. But what we also see are very many similarities to the Global South. I think one of the things we try to pay attention to is that we often have very arbitrary distinctions between work in the developing world and in the U.S. We seem to forget the fact that folks travel and they move. And so oftentimes those same folks in one space are often the same communities in other spaces and more developed spaces. And oftentimes the resources aren't reflecting the resources of the general society. So even though refugee populations may have been coming from more deprivation, oftentimes they're experiencing different forms of deprivation when they arrive in the U.S. So these are some of the lessons that we've been learning in that work. I think it's been said already by Jamie Rose and Kajwa that gender is an explicit lens of our work. And we offer that lens because it's a way that we begin our work from the margins. We don't stop there, though. We also, like many of you, take a racial justice lens. We take a gender justice lens, a sexuality and gender performing justice lens. We try to really start from the margins and work our way in terms of the access to power and access to resources. Another piece of our work is Girls Are Not Women and Children. We've seen this in humanitarian spaces. We've seen them in the anti-violence against women and girls movement. We see this in racial justice movements, that we talk about women and children, but adolescent girls are not women, which means that they are still facing kind of disenfranchisement based on their age. And they're not children, so that they have more agency and oftentimes are more vulnerable because they're not children and they're not women. And so if we do not name them explicitly in the work, they often are left out of that work. We look at work that is transnational, intersectional. I think the intersectionality was touched upon already. But really kind of thinking about the various vulnerabilities that young women and girls face, immigration and citizenship status being one of them, and that whether it's in humanitarian crisis or when girls are resettled, the assumption that oftentimes when they're resettled, they're automatically safe doesn't always pan out in the narratives of young women. And so I think one of the lessons that we've also been learning is that in the U.S., there seems to be a lot of the work focused on men and boys often assumes that work can happen because the girls are actually doing okay. And that's often the case in humanitarian settings, is also that we assume that girls are doing okay because they're often so functional. They're doing so much of the work in the community and in the household. And the reality is that they're often not doing okay. They just suffer differently and often silently. And so paying attention to that and naming that explicitly ensures that those specific needs are met. So we thought we'd offer some examples of some of our grantee partners that are also using attending to the needs of refugees, particularly of women and girls. And so one is the International Rescue Committee's work with the New Roots program, which focuses on food security for new refugee populations, but also in urban food deserts. So looking at a community as a whole and thinking about how refugee communities, by bringing in foods from their homelands can kind of revitalize urban food deserts and provide nourishment to all members of the community. And in that work, having an intentional gender lens and understanding that women and girls are often responsible for the feeding of families, and that they need to be centered in the leadership and in the work that happens for those communities. Girl Forward is an organization in Chicago and Austin, Texas, that actually why I thought this would be interesting to share is that they use the safe spaces model that the Population Council started utilizing in Nairobi in Kenya, and brings that safe spaces model into working with very similar populations, but in Chicago and Austin, Texas. And what's exciting about their work is that they deal with gender and youth-based institutional barriers. So recognizing, for example, that oftentimes in the countries of origin, if there was a choice on who could attend schools, girls often didn't attend schools. So when they migrate or when they're resettled, oftentimes what that creates is that there's a gap in their educational trajectory, and so that oftentimes they're struggling not only with learning to speak English, but also learning, dealing with gaps in literacy that are often hyper-focused among girls than for boys. And then Khmer Girls in Action works is based in Long Beach, California, and one of the things we found really interesting about their work and thought it would be helpful to share is that there's really a trauma-informed focus there, and looking at healthcare systems and organizing and community mobilization that is really attends to the healthcare needs of young people in refugee communities, and does this in a school-based setting so that it not only is supporting refugee youth, but also by supporting Khmer youth, they're also providing services to the broader school population. And so it's, to me, a really great example of when you serve those on the margins, you end up serving everyone. And that also has a really great model that's similar to Freedom Inc. of really engaging boys in a way that's accountable to young women and girls. And so just as we're going around and doing our learning, there's some questions that we're asking that we have no answers to, but we're learning, actively learning. And so one of those is, how do we hear from young women in their own languages and in communities through their own narratives in ways that are culturally responsive and relevant? Recognizing that our focus is on girls and young women of color, but within that there's so much diversity. And how do we make sure that we're hearing from girls in spaces where they're not being heard or they're not meant to be heard, but also in spaces where they're active and vocal and organizing? And so how do we do both? And then how can social justice agendas reflect the gendered lives of girls and young women, even on topics that people think are culturally inappropriate? So oftentimes violence, sexual violence, ends up being caught up in that category. They're not priority because people are dealing with more dire needs. They're too sensitive of topics in new communities. They're unsafe topics, or they're not urgent topics. Oftentimes those are the ways we characterize the challenges that young women face. And how we really get at those issues in ways that feel authentic for young women. And just knowing that, just thought we'd share a little bit about what you miss when you don't really bring a gendered lens and a youth-focused lens and a racial justice lens to work with refugee communities. You miss issues like early and forced marriage, sexual and reproductive access for English language learners, that it's not just enough to provide materials if they're not accessible by language, sexual identity for girls impacted by FGM, so that whether or not the practice is happening in the States, young women are still living with the consequences of the practice, and so what does that mean for them? Educational access for students with interrupted formal schooling, I mentioned that earlier, and just among a host of other issues that when you bring in a gender lens to working with refugee communities, you gain so much, and you're able to make sure that you're serving those that are often missed. And then finally, one of the takeaways that we have, there's a major gap in this space as we're moving around the country and trying to make sure that we're hearing from refugee and immigrant communities. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to do that, and we're looking for partners and folks that are interested in also learning and doing that. No matter what you're funding, you have to be explicit about adolescent girls, or they don't they get missed, and we've seen this over and over again. And then also, finally, that residency and immigration status has a huge impact on the lives of adolescent girls, and just to make sure that across whatever program that we're just really mindful about the impact that those two pieces have on the lives of girls and young women of color. And hopefully that wasn't too fast or too slow, so thank you.
That was perfect, Ramatu. It's a perfect pace, and thank you so much for sharing your strategies, your experience, and knowledge that you've learned, best practices through your programs, and the learning agenda that you're engaged in. So we really appreciate you sharing all of that. Thank you. And I'd like to now move on to hear from Ted Wang from Unbound Philanthropy. We're very honored to have you as well. Ted is the Director of U.S. Programs at Unbound Philanthropy. He previously had a public policy consulting practice and worked at two nonprofit organizations, Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area. Ted litigated discrimination and voting rights cases and drafted local and state laws promoting immigrant rights, racial justice, and small business development. Ted is originally from Taipei, Taiwan, and he is also a member of the GSER Board of Directors. So we're very honored to have you, Ted. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bear with us. We seem to have lost Ted's audio, and we'll just take a minute to find him and unmute him.
So while we wait for Ted, I'm going to step ahead for just a moment and just provide a brief background on funding recommendations that we'll be posting to the GSER website for your reference. That includes some of what we've learned about today, and we'll also, here we go. So funding recommendations. So these will be available on our GSER website, and these are often things that intersect also with generally our newcomer communities. And really something that we've heard about repeatedly today is really truly understanding newcomer communities beyond just the demographics and characteristics, but really learning from refugee communities and immigrant communities about their lived experiences through listening sessions, community convenings, really engaging. And as we've heard repeatedly today, and importantly, the need to really be mindful of women and girls and LGBTQ experiences and make sure that those voices are also present and heard. And in addition to that is really also responding to what we view as meeting basic needs and protecting fundamental rights. And that's responding to xenophobia and hostile environments, which is, currently we're in a very challenging environment with respect to this. And so we have some recommendations around this as well. And evaluating opportunities to address gender and racial equity challenges through collaborative grant making and cross-sector approaches, which we've seen used across the country. And we have many great examples we could share about collaborative learning as well as collaborative grant making. In addition to this, we also have some recommendations related to enhancing educational achievement and opportunities, specifically higher education opportunities. We heard today a very moving story about an opportunity that was not completed, and now Rahua is back on track and really received support from her community organization to regain access to higher education opportunities. And so really connecting that and the importance of that, we heard so powerfully today. In addition, are improving employment outcomes. So one thing that we do find with some of our refugee community, which is highly diverse, is that we do have many refugees who have high skills. Some of them come as physicians, doctoral degrees, a wide range of employable skills, but also face challenges with credentialing and recognition of their past support. So in addition to that, I think is the need to tap into YOM. We explain a little bit more about that in our funding recommendations. Integration into the financial mainstream. And what we mean by this is really increasing access to and information on financial education and literacy. And this means ensuring that refugees and their families have access to formal banking, can access credit, can purchase homes, and all of the pieces that go into a financial education. And that can really improve your outcomes. Also for small businesses and entrepreneurs, we know among our refugee community, there are many entrepreneurs. We see it all over our communities across the country. And so this is really a component of support and integration into the community. And then finally, enhancing civic participation. And this can happen through citizenship funding collaboratives, broader civic engagement initiatives such as leadership building and community organizing. So there are quite a number of opportunities in terms of civic participation. And I think we heard very powerfully today from Freedom Inc. about social change and organizing and supporting organizations that connect to social change and building leadership from the community. So I think that is those are some of the funding recommendations that we have that will be available on our resource website connected to this PowerPoint presentation. And I think we have Ted on the line.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Ted.
I'm really sorry.
That's okay. I'm glad we were able to find you. So I'm going to jump back to your first slide, and welcome, Ted. We're so glad to have you.
Okay. Again, my apologies. I had a brief electrical outage, and so it knocked my phone offline. Because I know we're near the end of the webinar, I wanted to just echo the speakers about how it's really inspiring to learn about the extraordinary programs that have been shared on this webinar. And I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. I'm going to talk about efforts to increase civic engagement of refugee adults. I work at a foundation called Unbound Philanthropy, and we support immigrant rights advocacy, leadership development in the U.S. and the U.K. But like many funders in the U.S., we really haven't prioritized funding for refugee issues, in part because there's so many other pressing concerns in our field, but also because refugees account for a relatively small part of the newcomer population in this country. You can go to the next slide. But like many of you on this call, we've become increasingly concerned that refugees, especially those from predominantly Muslim countries, are being targeted by xenophobic groups. The misinformation that these groups are spreading, combined with growing public concern about terrorism from abroad, is eroding support for refugee resettlement and has created a climate in which Muslim newcomers in particular have come under attack. And as a longtime funder within the immigration field, I think one of our broader concern is that the public tends to lump newcomers together, even if they have differences among themselves. So when one group comes under attack, there's really a good chance that other immigrants will also be adversely affected. In fact, when you look at what anti-refugee forces are saying about refugees today, it's really the same tired stereotypes that have been used to create fear of immigrants throughout our country's history. They're saying that refugees don't share our values. They can't integrate or assimilate. They're saying that refugees are dangerous, even though they go through an extraordinary security process before they can be led into this country. They're saying that refugees don't contribute to this country, that they just use public services. And we know that these these kinds of claims are patently false. They've been disproved by studies that looked at the integration of refugees who have settled in the U.S. from Africa, from Asia, and Eastern Europe. And all of them point out that refugees are really quite well integrated into the U.S. communities who live in both economically and culturally. Yet these attacks, though, have been effective in stoking fears of refugees in many parts of the country. So, for example, last year, 31 governors issued statements or directives that opposed refugee resettlement in their states, particularly refugees from Syria. And this year, we have over 50 bills that have been introduced in 19 state legislatures to stop or slow down refugee settlement, though I should point out that relatively few of these have been adopted. As a foundation that's funded efforts to support basically public we funded efforts to build public support for immigration reform and the fair treatment of newcomers generally. We know that there's no quick and easy way to improve public opinion. But I think if there's one thing that immigration funders would agree on, it's the point that a number of the speakers on this webinar have made, which is that if you're going to bring about positive change, build public support, you really need to have active participation by the leaders of the affected communities. We've seen this in the immigrant rights field, where dreamers and their families, day laborers, domestic workers, just to name a few examples, have really changed the way the public views immigrants for the better, because their personal stories have helped Americans understand who they are and their aspirations. Their stories have made it, I think, much harder for anti-immigrant forces to try to define them as the other, as somebody who's unknown, as someone who's fundamentally different than the rest of us. And their voices and engagement with the broader community has really helped, I think, address anxieties that many Americans may feel about foreigners, even if they don't necessarily hold anti-immigrant views. So when Unbound Philanthropy decided to look into how we can support refugees, we wanted to take a look at this model, a leadership development and civic engagement approach, and to see whether that could help empower refugees while dispelling some of the misperceptions of them that have really reduced public support for resettlement. So in exploring this idea, we didn't find actually that many national organizations that engage in this kind of empowerment work. The most interesting work is being done at the local level. But we did end up talking to some national groups that were interested, and in particular, we funded a couple projects, but the one that I want to just briefly describe to you is a civic engagement project that is run by Church World Services. And we co-funded this with the Carnegie Corporation of New York. For those of you who aren't familiar with Church World Service, it's a large refugee agency, resettlement agency. But it's unique in that it's also quite active in the immigrant rights advocacy world and has done a lot of advocacy around immigration reform and opposing anti-immigrant proposals. It also is one of the few resettlement agencies that I know of that actually has organizers, because it believes that part of the integration process for refugees should be to get them civically engaged. So since about 9 months ago, Church World Services has been developing kind of civic engagement and leadership trainings to hundreds. It's been offering it to hundreds of refugee leaders in the 8 localities that are on your slide. And the localities are in places like Georgia, Ohio, North Carolina, Texas, and other places where anti-refugee sentiment is running quite high. If you go to the next slide, the goals and the content of the trainings are really not just about teaching refugee leaders specific civic engagement skills or organizing skills. This project really tries to create spaces where refugees from different backgrounds and nationalities can come together to work on their shared goals, and to try to change things locally that can improve the quality of life for their communities. I know I'm running out of time, so I won't go into the details of the trainings themselves, but it's really a set of trainings. They start out fairly simple, teaching refugees about how to tell their story, their community stories. They move on to setting kind of shared priorities within their community. They do power mapping. They try to kind of go deeper into advocacy, identify allies, as well as to develop campaign strategies. And because the project is quite new, it's only 9 months old, it's really too early to assess what its impact has been. But I think it's clearly helping at least some refugee leaders to participate in debates that affect their communities. So if you go to the next slide, in half of the localities where these trainings have been held, Greensboro, Durham, Harrisburg, and Columbus, the trained refugee leaders have identified shared priorities and are reaching out to allies. They're meeting with elected officials. They're speaking to the media. And in each of these 4 localities, there's more than 25 active leaders who are carrying out these activities. So for example, in North Carolina, the trained participants organize opposition to anti-refugee bills by making calls and writing letters to legislators, and they helped organize a unity walk with other immigrant rights advocates. In Harrisburg, Virginia, these refugee leaders are trying to persuade the local DMV to offer driver's license tests in languages that are commonly spoken in their communities. And in Durham, the refugee leaders have met with the mayor, and they've asked him to support a resolution to welcome refugees and other newcomers. Let me just say in wrapping up, I recognize that the Church World Service project, and you can go to the next slide, is still really new. There's not a lot of data about its impact yet. But this is a project that I think Church World Service is very much willing to share with other organizations. They've developed a curriculum that they've been testing out and changing. And it's a program that I think other refugee-serving groups could adopt if they're interested. You know, for me, the most encouraging development since we first started looking into this area a year ago is that there is more interest among refugee-serving agencies to engage their clients and constituents. A couple of national agencies are developing similar projects, and there's this interesting civic engagement collaboration that's coming together in Texas, which is probably one of the most difficult and most challenging political environments for refugees. And the one thread that runs through these projects is this growing realization that refugees can play an important role in improving the environment for all newcomers. And because refugees speak from firsthand experience, they can be particularly effective at countering misinformation, dispelling stereotypes, and starting to change the hearts and minds of people who have limited contact with their communities. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Ted. I'm so glad that we were able to recover you online, and we greatly appreciate your shared experience and look forward to hearing about the future impact as the project moves forward. And since I was able to jump ahead and do the funding recommendations, we're actually at our Q&A point, and I'd like to just stop for a moment and check if there are any questions that anyone would like to raise at this point. Please raise your hand in the chat function. And Ted, it seems there are some folks that are very interested in the civic engagement trainings, so we'll be happy to connect you and ensure that you are connected to those that are expressing interest in these particular trainings. And
I would welcome learning from other funders as well, because this is a relatively new area, and if anyone else is funding kind of civic engagement trainings, it is an opportunity to get the kind of good work that's being done to be incorporated in the programs I've described.
Great, thank you so much. So this actually brings us to the close of our webinar. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, and we'd also like to ask you to take a moment to provide us with some feedback on our webinar today. So I have jumped ahead to our evaluation portion, and we ask that you please type in your results here. How would you rate the overall webinar, with 5 being the highest rating? And I'll give everyone a few moments to respond. And next, we'd just like to know what other issues related to refugees and global migration would you like to see included in future webinars, and what resources would be useful. Just to remind everyone, we will be posting the funder recommendations. We will have some articles and reports available related to the webinar topic on refugee integration. And I'm sure that all of our speakers, our foundations, and our organizations would welcome any questions or follow-up that you're interested in doing. We'd be happy to facilitate that. And we know that there may be opportunities for future webinars related to refugee and global migration issues. We know that there's been interest around advocacy and communications. So we look forward to working with those that are interested. And we'd like to just close a thank you to our speakers again, a really stellar set of presentations that really brought us right into the refugee space to understand firsthand those that are working in communities across the United States, and from our foundations, those that are developing strategies and sharing their learning with all of us. And we welcome any comments or suggestions. You can please direct them to me at aria@gser.org. And if you'd like to learn more about GSER, please feel free to email me, Aria Summers-Landsberger, Director of Programs. And again, thank you to our speakers, Jamie Rose, Rahwa, Kabjwa, Ramatu, and Ted, for all of your time and effort in preparing for today's webinar. And in celebration of World Refugee Day, thank you to all of you all for taking time to join us today. Goodbye.